street ran in a straight, steep line down to the western sea, and all the houses were built the same way. A long row of mud huts with straw roofs that Loop thought looked sweet. I thought that they looked as if one good gust of wind would send them all tumbling into the water. I normally ran to the market square, skidding downhill on my heels because the ravens liked to fly low and running put them off. Today, though, I settled for a fast walk. After all, I was almost at the top of the school now. It didn't seem right to run like a little child. Masha, who lived across the street, was standing in her doorway. I waved, trying to see past her into the house. "Looking for someone?" she smiled, her lined face crinkling like old paper. "Pablo's already left. You know the governor likes them to be at work before dawn." Masha's son Pablo had been born when she was already old, her belly swelling even as her hair turned grey and her face creasing with age. Masha called it a miracle, and Pablo was miraculous. Gabbo and I had always been in awe of him, as all the villagers were, because of his strength. Aged 10, he could lift his parents one over each shoulder. Having a piggy bank from Pablo felt like flying, but it had been a long time since I'd seen him. 2 years ago, when his mother's back got too bad, Pablo left school and took her place as a labourer, although Masha pleaded with him not to. Now 15, he pulled carts as if they were paper, and cared for the governor's horses too. "He took the present for Loop," Masha added, wrinkling her nose. I knew she didn't understand why I chose to be friends with the governor's daughter. "I told him to hide it like you asked." "Thank you," I said. "Maybe I'll see him tomorrow." "Maybe," but her voice was not hopeful. He was always up before sunrise, home after dark. I waved goodbye, shouldered my satchel and started down the hill. From this high up, Gromero looked like a wheel or a starburst, with the market square at its centre and streets like spokes spiking outwards, some ending at the wide calm harbour that bottlenecked into the sea, ripe with fish. On a clear night the stars settled on its surface like water lilies. The governor's ship was moored there as always. Dar said it was carved from a single Afrique baobab trunk. The baobab must be an enormous tree, because the hull nearly spanned the width of the port, the mast arrowing towards the sky, the sails stowed. It crouched over the fishing fleet like a mountain, huge and unmoving. Like everything the governor had, it took up far more space than it ought to. To the east, his house glinted in the sunrise. Built from black basalt and big as 5 ships, the mansion sat between the blue sea and the green forest, spreading out over the fields like a storm cloud. From here, though it looked small, enough to squash between my forefinger and thumb, below it was the village and the school halfway between. The old school building had been small but bright, and we had painted the walls rainbow colours with whatever dyes Dar could spare. But when the governor had knocked it down, Loop had decided she had had enough of being taught alone at home and demanded to be sent to the local school like the rest of us. Governor Adori had rebuilt it from stone, twice as big, because if his daughter was going, it had to look grander. "Not for me, you understand," Loop had said with a sad smile. She adopted an even posher voice to add, "to uphold the family honour." We weren't allowed to paint the walls of the new school. A lot of children were unkind to Loop because of that, but I knew it wasn't her fault. Behind the governor's house, close to the forest, was the orchard, where I had never been. I squinted at the ant-like specks of the labourers there and wondered which one was Pablo. To the west, the black sand of the beaches was almost covered by the incoming tide. We were not allowed to be on the beaches at high tide, and no one was allowed in the water unless they were launching one of the governor's boats. My toes itched. Dar had described being in the sea, but it was not the same as trying it for myself. Above the beeches were the clay mines, which I tried not to look at because it brought back one of the few clear memories I had of Ma. The day she took Gabbo and me to the mines, she taught us how to tie ourselves with vines to the dragon tree. You knot like this, and then rub the sap into your hand for grip, and lowered us one by one into the gorge. Gabbo got scared and wriggled so much the knot broke. When he landed on the soft mud at the bottom, it made a very rude noise, and he was filthy when Ma climbed up with him from the darkness. I laughed so hard it hurt. I remembered that ache in my belly, how it came back 2 months later when Ma died. Only then it was sharper, and then there was no one carrying anyone out of that darkness. 3 years on the same sweating sickness took Gabbo. 3 years after that, the clay mine memory still made my throat feel tight. Loop always met me by a barrel at the edge of the market square so we could walk to school together, even though it meant she had to get up almost as early as the labourers. When I got to the square, a queue was already forming for the well. More and more people used it since the river Arintara began drying up. All the stalls were open selling fish and grain and leather. Most of the stores belonged to the governor, their cool blue awnings like a patch of sky, with the honey stall, a bright sun yellow in the middle. As I made my way towards the barrel, somebody grasped my wrist. I jumped, stumbling against a nearby stall and vegetables tumbling to the dusty ground. "Hey!" the storekeeper growled. "What do you think you're doing?" I turned to see who was gripping me. It was a woman dressed in green robes, which meant she worked in the orchards. She should already be there. Latecomers were sometimes whipped. "I'm sorry," the woman said to the storekeeper, without taking her eyes from my face. "Isabella Rossi?" "Yes," I said. "Who?" "Something has happened." She clutched my wrist harder. She was so small, her face almost level with mine. "What do you think you're doing?" the storekeeper repeated, stepping out from behind his piles of potatoes. "Kata!" hissed the woman, ignoring him. "Have you seen her?" I frowned. Kata Rodriguez? Kata was in my class at school, but we had only spoken a couple of times before. The woman nodded fiercely. "I'm her mother," she said. "You were friends? I thought maybe you knew where she was." I shifted uncomfortably. It was true that I was nicer to Kata than anyone else, but she was very quiet and mostly people ignored her. "I'm sorry," I began. "I haven't. I've looked everywhere. She wasn't there when I woke up. The woman broke off, breathing hard. Her hand fluttered to her chest, as if she could not fill her lungs. "You! What are you doing here?" Kata's mother jumped. One of the governor's men was striding towards us, the crowd parting like wheat before his blue tunic. "If you see her, send her home," the woman said to me, hurriedly, face twisted with worry. And then she was gone, running in the direction of the governor's estate. "What a mess," tutted the storekeeper, starting to pick up the vegetables. "No, don't help. You've caused enough trouble already." Dazed, I walked to the corner of the market square where Loop and I always met. Something in the woman's face had shaken me, right to the bones. I hoped Kata was all right. "Isa!" I spun around as Loop came running across the square, satchel flying. The other villagers shrunk back from her. The governor's daughter did not have many friends, not that Loop cared. "I don't give a fig," she'd say to one of the girls teasing her about her fussy plait her mother insisted on. "Isabella likes them, and that's enough for me." We made an odd set, Loop and I, she as taller as a near-grown boy, and I barely reaching her shoulders. She seemed to have got even taller in the months since I had last seen her. Her mother would not be pleased. Signora Adori was a petite, elegant woman with sad eyes and a cold smile. Loop said she never laughed and believed girls should not run, nor have any right to be as tall as Loop was getting. She squeezed me tightly and then drew back, eyeing me up and down. "Still so short," she said enviously, then frowned. What's wrong? You've gone all pale. Did your Da not let you out in the sun this summer? Mama does that, but sometimes I sneak out. Katar's missing, I pushed the words out. I just saw her mother. Katar? I rolled my eyes impatiently. The girl who sits at the back. Loop shifted from one foot to another. She had that look on her face like Pep sauntering away from a broken dish. I stared at her. What? What? Said Loop, pulling her satchel higher on her shoulder. You know something, I stepped forward. No, I don't. She stepped back. I raised my eyebrow the way Da had taught me. Loop wilted. I'm sure it's nothing. It's just... She was working in the kitchen this summer and I asked her to go to the orchard for me yesterday to get some... The orchard! The sick feeling in my stomach was back. Loop, you know we're not allowed. Yes, of course I know, but I hadn't had dragon fruit in ages. I needed to have them on my birthday, didn't I? I had never had dragon fruit and was not even sure what they looked like, but I did know they were Loop's favourite, grown in the governor's orchard at the edge of the forest, out of bounds to everyone except his guards and a few of his servants. Loop, you know that if Kata got caught, she's probably at the Didalo right now. Loop waved her hand dismissively. Still on about that place. I've never seen it, and I lived there. It was typical that Loop should not notice something right under her nose, and the Didalo, the labyrinth, was right under her nose, because Governor Dory had built his house directly over the natural tunnels that were now his prison. Marsha's husband had served a decade there before he died. Loop flung her arm around my shoulder. Come on, grumpy guts. Kata will be fine. She began to propel me along the narrow streets towards the fields. She'll already be in class, probably stuffing her face with my dragon fruit. I'll let you have some. They're so delicious. And don't forget the fireworks tonight. Loop hated the dark, but she loved fireworks. They were extraordinary, with their beautiful colours and falling starshine, but they scared Pep too much for me to like them. Papa's let me pick the colours. They're gold ones and blue ones, 2 red ones. I let Loop's voice wash over me as we took our shortcut across the fields. She was probably right. Even if Kata had been caught, surely the governor's men wouldn't have thrown a girl into the Didalo just for stealing fruit. I promised myself I'd be extra nice to Kata at school, maybe even invite her to watch Loop's birthday fireworks from my garden. Oh, and you haven't seen this, said Loop, stopping suddenly and jerking me to a halt. What? Loop untucked a thick gold chain from her dress and held it out on her palm. A gold locket glinted in the sunlight, engraved with a shape I recognized. That's a freak. Where Papa is from, said Loop. He gave it to me for my birthday. It was my grandmother's. What's inside? Loop shrugged. Da says I'm not allowed to open it until I'm older. He's the only one with the key. It's lovely. It's heavy, said Loop, but I like it. It was all I got, though. She looked at me expectantly. I tried to pretend I didn't know what she was waiting for, but she was grinning so stupidly I couldn't keep it up. I took out a scroll from my satchel. Happy birthday, I said, grinning too. A map marked with an X. It was a very simple map, with no star lines and a compass that was only an arrow with an N on the end. I hadn't had time to make it a proper hunt with lots of clues. Treasure, I squeezed Loop's fingers. No point just standing there, Loop shouted, bounding ahead. Race you! With her long legs, Loop should have been the favourite, but she was as uncoordinated as a one-legged rabbit, and so we ran together. My lungs filled as I ran across the dry field, bag slapping my side. Kata will be at school. Loop will get her dragon fruit, and everything will be all right. At last, Loop reached the X, the abandoned rabbit's warren, where Pablo had hidden the present for me. Inside sat a small twist of blue paper. She unwrapped the simple plaited bracelet, made with leftover thread I had begged from Masha. Woven in amongst the multicoloured strands was a single thread of gold I had stolen from Dar's study. He never made special maps anymore, so I didn't think he would notice. I love it! Loop wound it around her wrist and I tied the knot. It's my favourite present. Only Loop would prefer a scrappy piece of string to a pure gold locket. It was another thing I liked about her. Come on, I said, taking her sweaty palm and pulling her towards the low rectangle of school. Being late for the first day might be all right for Loop, a Dory, but Signora Fellers would not forgive plain old Isabella Rossi so easily. We broke into another run, hoping not to hear the bell, and arrived in a dead heat, panting and laughing, stitches needling our sides. I won, Loop gasped. No, me. I beat you. Girls, Signora Fellers appeared at the school door, her face sour as a lemon. When she recognized Loop, her face went as sour as 2 lemons. Senorita Adori, you should have been told. I sent someone straight to your father. What? Loop frowned. Why? There's been well, your father will tell you, I'm sure. School is closed today. Closed? I said stupidly. But why? Enough questions, snapped the teacher. Then her face drained as her eyes fixed on something behind us. We turned to see a carriage drawn by a pair of dun stallions picking its way slowly across the pitted path from the village. The horses seemed restless, sidestepping and shaking back their manes. 2 men sat beside the driver, the sun glinting off their swords. The carriage's blue curtains were drawn, protecting its passengers from the heat, but even at this distance I could make out the broad governor and his tiny wife silhouetted through the silk.